This photograph appears to be nothing more than what it claims to be. A simple classroom portrait from 1893, the kind that fills dusty archives across America. 23 children arranged in neat rows, their faces frozen in that peculiar Victorian stillness that came from holding perfectly still for long exposure times. A stern-faced teacher stands at the side, her hand resting on an ornate desk. The wooden floorboards are worn, the walls bare except for a map of the United States that still shows the territories. Everything about this image screams ordinary, mundane, forgotten. But if you look closely at the third row, second child from the left, you'll notice something that shouldn't be possible. Something that defies every law of photography, chemistry, and perhaps reality itself. The photograph was donated to the Ashford Hollow Historical Society in March 2019 by the estate of Eleanor Pemberton, a woman who had spent her entire life in this small Pennsylvania town tucked into the coal country hills. It arrived in a cardboard box with dozens of other items, ledgers, letters, mining company documents, all the detritus of a family that had watched their town slowly die as the mines closed one by one. For 6 months, the photograph sat in storage, just another piece of Victorian ephemera waiting to be catalogued. Margaret Chen, a volunteer archivist with a background in digital restoration, pulled it from the collection on a Tuesday afternoon in September. She'd been tasked with digitizing the Society's photographic holdings, a project that would take years. This was supposed to be image number 47 in her catalog. Routine, unremarkable. But when she placed the photograph under her high-resolution scanner, and the image appeared on her screen, Margaret's hand froze over her mouse. The detail was extraordinary, far beyond what she expected from a 126-year-old image. And there, in the third row, something was wrong. Terribly, impossibly wrong. What Margaret Chen discovered that September afternoon would launch an investigation that would consume photographic experts, historians, and forensic analysts for the next 4 years. It would uncover a tragedy that had been deliberately erased from history, and it would force us to confront a question that science still cannot answer. But before we dive into this nightmare, if you're new here and love spine-chilling stories, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when the next one drops. Now, let's begin. The photograph measures 8 by 10 inches, mounted on deteriorating cardboard backing with Willowbrook Grammar School, March 17th, 1893, written in faded ink along the bottom edge. 23 children stare into the camera with that characteristic Victorian solemnity, their faces slightly blurred by the long exposure times required by the Victorian process used in that era. Every detail Margaret Chen examined seemed perfectly authentic. The girls wore high-neck dresses with leg-of-mutton sleeves, fashionable in the early 1890s. The boys in wool suits with short pants, their hair slicked back with pomade. Teacher Abigail Thornton, identified by a notation on the reverse side, stood at the left edge of the frame in a severe black dress, her expression betraying no warmth. The classroom itself provided a wealth of period detail: slate tablets on wooden desks, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the boy in the third row. Margaret noticed it first in the digital scan. His face possessed a clarity that didn't match the other children. While every other student showed the slight motion blur inevitable in 1890s photography, this child's features were impossibly sharp. His eyes, dark and penetrating, seemed to look directly through the camera. The focus was wrong, as if he'd been photographed with different technology entirely. But more disturbing was his positioning. The other children maintained careful separation, each occupying their own space as necessary for proper exposure. This boy appeared to overlap slightly with the child beside him, his shoulder existing in a space that should have been occupied by another student. The physics didn't work. Margaret spent 3 days examining the scan before contacting Dr. Patricia Vance, a photographic historian at the Rochester Institute of Technology, who specialized in 19th-century imaging processes. Dr. Vance arrived 2 weeks later with specialized equipment to examine the original photograph. What she found in the emulsion layers made her request additional experts. The silver halide crystals in the area containing the mysterious child showed patterns that shouldn't exist, a level of grain structure inconsistent with 1890s materials, chemical compositions that defied the known development processes of the era. Under magnification, the emulsion appeared disturbed, as if something had impressed itself onto the plate, not through light exposure, but through some other mechanism entirely. Dr. Vance's preliminary report, delivered in November 2019, contained a single, devastating conclusion. The child's image was simultaneously original to the photograph and impossible to explain by any known photographic process. The boy was there, but he shouldn't be. Willowbrook Grammar School opened its doors in September 1887 to serve the children of Ashford Hollow, a coal mining community of approximately 800 souls nestled in the Allegheny foothills of western Pennsylvania. The school occupied a 2-story wooden structure on Maple Street. Funded by contributions from the Consolidated Mining Company and local families who wanted their children to have opportunities beyond the mines. Teacher Abigail Thornton, a 28-year-old graduate of the Pittsburgh Normal School, arrived in 1889 and would remain at her post until the school closed in 1924, maintaining records with a precision that would prove both invaluable and deeply troubling to investigators 130 years later. Her attendance ledgers, enrollment documents, and correspondence survived intact in the Historical Society's collection, each page filled with her elegant, copperplate handwriting. Margaret Chen began cross-referencing these records against the photograph in October 2019, expecting to identify each child by name. The attendance ledger for March 17, 1893, listed 22 students present. She had recorded each name with a check mark, noting the time school commenced at 8 o'clock and dismissed at 3:30. 22 names, not 23. Margaret counted the children in the photograph again. 23 faces stared back. She pulled the enrollment records for the spring term of 1893. 22 students registered. She examined parent correspondence, tuition payment records, and even Abigail Thornton's personal notes about individual student progress. Every document accounted for every child visible in the photograph, except the boy in the third row, second from left. His face had no name. Local historian Daniel Marsh joined the investigation in November, bringing access to census records, church registries, and family genealogies he'd compiled over 40 years of research. He could trace the lineage of every child in that photograph. The Hendersons, the Pratts, the Kowalskis, families whose descendants still lived in the area. He knew their stories, their fates, which ones died young, and which ones lived to see the new century. 22 children, 22 documented lives. The 23rd child existed in the photograph and nowhere else. No birth record in Ashford Hollow or surrounding townships. No mention in church baptismal records. No name in any document associated with Willowbrook Grammar School. The boy appeared in the image with perfect clarity, his dark suit and white collar identical to those worn by other students, his posture suggesting he belonged in that classroom. But according to every piece of historical evidence, he was never there. He never existed, and that's when someone remembered the mining disaster of March 3rd, 1893. Dr. Robert Hastings arrived in Ashford Hollow in February 2020 with a reputation that preceded him: forensic photograph analysis for the FBI, expert testimony in 43 federal cases, published research on detecting photographic manipulation dating back to the daguerreotype era. If anyone could explain the anomaly, it would be Hastings. The Historical Society had located the original glass plate negative in a storage box marked School Records 1890 to 1895, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper and remarkably intact despite its age. Hastings examined it first with the naked eye, then under magnification, then with specialized equipment he'd transported from his laboratory in New York. His preliminary assessment took 6 hours. His full analysis would take 3 months and produce a 78-page report that concluded with the statement he'd never written before in his career. The evidence contradicts known photographic science. The glass plate negative measured 8 by 10 inches, typical for commercial photography of the 1890s. The emulsion consisted of collodion suspended in silver halide crystals, the standard process for the era. Under microscopic examination, every aspect of the negative appeared authentic. The glass showed age-appropriate deterioration. The emulsion displayed characteristic cracking patterns. Even the dust particles trapped in the collodion dated correctly. This was not a modern forgery. The negative had been created in 1893, exactly as the date indicated. But the area containing the mysterious child violated every principle of photographic chemistry. Hastings discovered that the silver halide crystals in that specific region showed an impossible density pattern. They were simultaneously overexposed and underexposed, a state that cannot exist in conventional photography. The grain structure suggested exposure to light wavelengths that shouldn't have been captured by 1890s photographic materials. When he conducted spectroscopic analysis, he found trace elements in the emulsion that had no business being there, compounds that wouldn't be used in photography for another 60 years. The exposure pattern itself defied physics. In normal photography, light passes through a lens, strikes the emulsion, and creates a latent image through chemical reaction. The boy's image showed no evidence of passing through a lens. The light patterns suggested direct impression, as if the image had somehow materialized onto the plate without optical mediation. Hastings compared it to dozens of known examples of double exposure, photographic manipulation, and early trick photography. Nothing matched. More disturbing were the edges where the boy's image met the surrounding photograph. There was no transition, no border, no evidence of compositional layering. The mysterious child existed simultaneously as part of the original exposure and as an impossible intrusion into it. Hastings wrote in his report, "The subject's image is integral to the negative's creation and inexplicable by any documented photographic process. The physical evidence suggests the image appeared on the plate through mechanisms outside conventional light exposure. This conclusion contradicts established photographic science, yet the material evidence admits no other interpretation. The boy was there from the beginning, but he couldn't be. The photograph was real, but it was impossible." Daniel Marsh had lived in Ashford Hollow his entire 73 years, and he'd heard the stories since childhood. Whispered tales about the consolidation mine disaster that his grandmother would tell on winter evenings, her voice dropping low when she reached the part about the boy who was never found. He'd dismissed them as folklore, the kind of ghost stories that accumulate around every tragedy. But when the photograph revealed its impossible occupant, Marsh returned to those old stories with new urgency. The mining disaster of March 3, 1893, remained the worst tragedy in Ashford Hollow's history. At 2:40 in the afternoon, a catastrophic collapse in the number 3 shaft buried 47 miners under thousands of tons of rock and earth. The rescue efforts continued for 5 days, but the depth of the collapse and the instability of the surrounding tunnels made recovery impossible. Company records, preserved in the Historical Society's archives, listed every victim by name: 39 men and 8 boys, the youngest just 9 years old. In 1893, child labor in Pennsylvania coal mines was officially illegal, but universally practiced. Poor families needed the income. Mining companies needed small bodies to work the narrow seams, and everyone agreed to look the other way. The 8 boys who died on March 3rd were documented because their deaths couldn't be hidden. Grieving families, funeral services, death certificates filed with the county. But Marsh found references to a 9th child in sources that predated the photograph by decades. A letter written in 1897 by former miner Joseph Halloway mentioned the boy they didn't count, the one still down there. An oral history interview from 1956 captured the testimony of Agnes Pratt, who'd been a student at Willowbrook in 1893. She spoke of the pale boy who came to school after the mine closed, the one nobody could quite remember. Local newspaper archives contained a peculiar gap. The Ashford Hollow Gazette's coverage of the disaster listed 47 victims initially, but a correction published on March 10, 1893, changed the count to 46 with no explanation. The legend persisted across generations with remarkable consistency. A boy had been working the consolidation mine illegally, so undocumented that even the company didn't know he was there. When the collapse came, he died with the others, but because he had no employment record, no official presence, the company simply erased him from the count. Easier than admitting they'd hired a child so young, so undocumented, that his existence could be denied. The boy's body remained in the tunnels. His name was lost. And according to the stories, his spirit appeared at Willowbrook Grammar School that spring, sitting in a classroom where he'd never been enrolled, staring into a camera 2 weeks after his death, leaving his image on a glass plate as the only proof he'd ever existed at all. The breakthrough came in January 21, when a descendant of Abigail Thornton donated a leather-bound journal to the Historical Society, discovered in an attic trunk during an estate sale. The journal covered the years 1891 to 1895, filled with daily observations about teaching, community events, and personal reflections written in Thornton's meticulous handwriting. Margaret Chen began reading it on a Thursday afternoon, and by page 47, she'd called Daniel Marsh and Dr. Hastings. The entry for March 6, 1893, 3 days after the mining disaster, described Thornton's struggle to maintain normalcy in her classroom while the community grieved. But embedded in her account of that day's lessons was a sentence that made Chen's hands tremble. She wrote of a peculiar sensation while teaching arithmetic, a feeling that one more child sat in the third row than should be there, though when she counted heads, she always arrived at the correct number of 22. The entry for March 10th grew more disturbed. Thornton described seeing a boy from the corner of her eye, always in the third row, second seat from the left. When she turned to look directly, the seat appeared empty or occupied by whichever student belonged there. But in her peripheral vision, the pale boy remained, his dark eyes fixed on her, his lips moving soundlessly as if trying to speak. She wrote that she'd dismissed it as exhaustion from the emotional toll of the disaster. The entry for March 15th, 2 days before the photograph, contained a passage that read like a confession. Thornton admitted she'd begun avoiding looking at the third row entirely because the presence had grown stronger, more insistent. She could feel him there during every lesson, a cold spot in the room that made students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Several children had complained of feeling watched. One girl, Emma Henderson, had asked why the new boy never spoke. When Thornton questioned what new boy, Emma couldn't provide a name, only a description: pale skin, dark eyes, dark suit, always silent. The journal entry for March 17th, the day of the photograph, contained just 3 sentences. Thornton wrote that she'd arranged for a traveling photographer to document her class, hoping the activity would lift everyone's spirits. She noted the photographer's name, the time of day, the cost of $3. And in the final line, she wrote that she'd felt the presence stronger than ever during the sitting, as if the pale boy wanted desperately to be remembered. But the most chilling discovery came from other sources. Reverend Thomas Blackwell's parish records included a notation dated March 20th, 1893, documenting a visit from 3 concerned parents whose children attended Willowbrook. They reported their sons and daughters speaking of a ghostly classmate, a boy who'd appeared after the mine disaster. The descriptions matched exactly. Pale, dark-eyed, seated in the 3rd row, visible only indirectly, never speaking. Blackwell had dismissed it as childhood imagination inflamed by recent tragedy. A letter from mining company supervisor Charles Brennan to his sister, dated March 24th, 1893, mentioned the strange stories circulating about a phantom child at the school. Multiple witnesses across multiple documents describing the same impossible boy, the same location, the same appearance. All in the 2 weeks between the mining disaster and the photograph that would prove, 127 years later, that their accounts were true. The cemetery records were stored in the basement of St. Michael's Episcopal Church. Leather-bound ledgers dating back to 1871, when Ashford Hollow first established its public burial ground. Margaret Chen and Daniel Marsh spent 2 weeks in February 2021 examining every entry from 1893, searching for anomalies. On page 37 of the March ledger, they found it. An entry dated March 5th, 1893, recording the burial of an unidentified male child, approximate age 10 to 12 years, interred in the paupers section without ceremony. No name, no family listed, just a plot number, Section D, Row 7, Grave 14. The notation indicated the body had been delivered by the Consolidation Mining Company, with instructions for immediate burial. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed human remains in the unmarked location. With permission from county authorities, forensic anthropologist Dr. Sarah Kim exhumed the grave in April 2021. The skeleton belonged to a male child, aged between 10 and 12, based on bone development and dental eruption patterns. But the critical discovery came during microscopic analysis of the bone tissue. Coal dust permeated the marrow, concentrated in patterns consistent with chronic exposure. This child had worked underground, breathing coal particles day after day, his growing bones absorbing the evidence of his labor. Dr. Kim's report established cause of death as massive trauma consistent with being crushed in a mine collapse. The final piece came from an unexpected source, a cache of Consolidation Mining Company documents sealed in a courthouse storage room since the company's bankruptcy in 1931, contained employment records that should never have existed. Hidden among hundreds of pages of official payroll data were handwritten ledgers documenting illegal child labor payments. off-the-books wages paid in cash to families desperate enough to send their youngest children into the mines. The ledger for February 1893 listed a name that appeared nowhere else in any official record: Thomas Weatherly, age 11, employed as a trapper boy for 6 cents per day. His job was to sit alone in the dark tunnels, opening and closing ventilation doors as coal cars passed. The most dangerous work given to the smallest children. Thomas Weatherly had no birth certificate filed in Pennsylvania, no census record, no school enrollment. He existed only in that secret ledger and in the bones buried in an unmarked grave. When the collapse came on March 3rd, the mining company faced a choice: admit they'd employed a child so young and so undocumented that acknowledging his death would expose their illegal practices, or simply erase him from the casualty list. They chose erasure. They buried his body in an unmarked grave. They excluded him from the official count. They destroyed any evidence he'd ever existed. But 2 weeks later, Thomas Weatherly sat for a photograph in a classroom where he'd never been enrolled, and his image burned itself onto a glass plate with an intensity that would survive 128 years. The boy they tried to erase had found a way to be remembered. Dr. Hastings had spent 30 years analyzing historical photographs, and the Thomas Weatherly case gnawed at him in ways no other investigation had. The chemical impossibilities, the eyewitness accounts, the convergence of tragedy and image. It suggested something systematic rather than singular. In June 2021, he began a comprehensive review of Victorian-era photographs associated with documented tragedies, requesting access to archives across the northeastern United States. What he discovered would transform the Weatherly photograph from an isolated mystery into evidence of a phenomenon that science still cannot explain. The first comparable case came from the Lawrence Textile Mill in Massachusetts. On December 11, 1891, a fire killed 32 workers, most of them young women and girls. A photograph taken 3 days later showed workers gathered outside the burned factory, ostensibly for a commemorative image, but standing in the back row, partially transparent yet impossibly detailed, appeared a young woman in a work dress. Factory employment records identified every person in the photograph except her. When Hastings examined the original glass plate negative, he found identical anomalies. The same impossible exposure patterns, the same chemical inconsistencies in the emulsion, the same appearance of an image that couldn't have been captured through conventional light exposure. The woman matched descriptions from survivor testimony of Agnes Murphy, age 17, whose body had been consumed entirely by the fire. The pattern repeated. A schoolhouse collapse in Marietta, Ohio, on April 23, 1895, killed 14 children when the second floor gave way during morning assembly. A photograph taken 1 week later for a memorial service showed the surviving students and teachers arranged on the front steps. In the back row stood a small girl in a white dress, her features crystal clear while everyone around her showed the characteristic blur of long exposure. School records counted every child in the image except her. Chemical analysis revealed the same emulsion anomalies. Local newspapers from 1895 mentioned parents claiming their children saw Elizabeth Donovan, age 8, standing with them during the memorial photograph, though her body had been buried 3 days earlier. The New York tenement fire of March 9, 1897, killed 41 residents, most of them recent immigrants whose identities were never firmly established. A newspaper photograph documenting the aftermath showed survivors gathered in front of the burned building. Among them appeared 3 figures that the newspaper's own records couldn't account for: a woman holding a baby and a young boy. All 3 displayed the same impossible clarity, the same chemical signatures that Hastings had found in the Weatherly photograph. By September 20, Hastings had documented 43 cases spanning from 1884 to 1903, all sharing identical characteristics: traumatic death, photographs taken within 2 weeks of the tragedy, unexplained figures showing impossible chemical properties, and historical accounts of witnesses claiming to see the deceased. The phenomenon appeared exclusive to the Victorian era, specifically the period when wet collodion and early gelatin silver processes dominated photography. Something about the combination of traumatic death and 19th century photographic chemistry created conditions that allowed the impossible to occur. The dead, it seemed, had found a way to insist on being remembered. The publication of Dr. Hastings' findings in the Journal of Photographic Science in November 2021 triggered something unprecedented in archival research: a systematic re-examination of Victorian-era photographic collections across North America. Within 6 months, over 300 archival institutions had launched review projects, training staff to identify the specific chemical signatures and visual anomalies that characterized what researchers were now calling post-mortem impression phenomena. The results were staggering. By January 2023, documented cases had reached 217, spanning from Nova Scotia to Texas, from 1882 to 1906. Each case followed the pattern Hastings had identified: photographs taken in proximity to tragedy, unexplained figures showing impossible photographic properties, historical evidence of cover-up or erasure. The National Archives in Washington discovered a photograph from the Johnstown flood of 1889 containing 6 unidentified figures standing among confirmed survivors, all displaying the characteristic emulsion anomalies. The Chicago History Museum found 3 separate photographs from the Iroquois Theater fire of 1903, each containing ghostly attendees that matched no survivor accounts. A family photograph collection in Vermont revealed an image from an 1892 diphtheria outbreak, showing 2 children who had died 3 days before the photograph was taken, their presence documented in family letters, but dismissed as grief-induced hallucination until the chemical evidence proved otherwise. The phenomenon clustered most densely around industrial disasters and child deaths, particularly cases where victims had been deliberately uncounted or officially erased. Mining disasters, factory fires, workplace accidents in an era before labor protections. tragedies where the dead were poor, recent immigrants, illegally employed children whose existence proved inconvenient to powerful interests. The photographs became a kind of testimony, evidence that resisted erasure, even when names were struck from records and bodies buried in unmarked graves. Thomas Weatherly's case remained the most thoroughly studied, the most scientifically documented, the most impossible to dismiss. His photograph had been examined by 17 separate specialists using equipment that could detect molecular-level forgery. His identity had been confirmed through forensic anthropology, archival research, and documentary evidence. His story had been reconstructed from sources that predated any knowledge of the photograph's anomaly. He was real. He was dead. And he had somehow impressed his image onto a glass plate through mechanisms that violated every principle of photographic science. Museums began creating exhibits specifically focused on these impossible photographs. The Smithsonian's 2022 exhibition, Seen and Unseen, Post-Mortem Photography and Historical Erasure, drew record crowds, with Thomas Weatherly's image as the centerpiece. Academic conferences formed around the phenomenon, bringing together photographic scientists, historians, and even parapsychologists searching for explanations. But every analysis, every theory, every attempt at rational explanation collapsed against the physical evidence. These images existed. They shouldn't. And Thomas Weatherly, the boy who sat in the third row of a classroom where he'd never been enrolled, had become the face of a mystery that bridged the gap between documented history and inexplicable reality. He was not alone. 216 other forgotten victims had found their way into photographs, insisting on being remembered, and researchers suspected these documented cases represented only a fraction of the true number, waiting to be discovered in archives around the world. The original glass plate negative remains in climate-controlled storage at the Pennsylvania Historical Society, housed in an archival box with precisely regulated temperature and humidity levels. The photograph can be viewed by appointment only, under supervision, with researchers required to wear cotton gloves and maintain a distance of at least 6 inches from the surface. Thomas Weatherly's grave in Ashford Hollow Cemetery now bears a proper headstone, installed in a ceremony on March 3, 22, exactly 129 years after his death. His name is carved in granite above the dates circa 1882, March 3, 1893, and the inscription, "Finally Remembered." His existence has been acknowledged, his story told, his erasure from history reversed. But the photograph itself remains inexplicable. In 2024, researchers at MIT applied the most advanced photographic analysis technology available, digital enhancement algorithms capable of detecting manipulation at the quantum level, spectroscopic analysis that can identify individual molecules in century-old emulsion, artificial intelligence trained on millions of historical photographs to detect any form of alteration or forgery. Every test confirmed what Dr. Hastings concluded in 2020. The image is original to the plate, created in 1893, impossible by every known principle of photographic science. The boy should not appear. The chemical composition should not exist. The exposure pattern defies the laws of physics as we understand them. Yet there he sits in the third row, second from left, his dark eyes staring through 132 years with an intensity that makes viewers uncomfortable. His face is clearer than any other child in the photograph, as if he's more present, more insistent on being seen. Museum visitors report feeling watched when they stand before the image. Security cameras have captured people backing away from the photograph suddenly, claiming they felt cold or sensed movement in the corner of their vision. The same descriptions that appeared in 1893 testimonies continue to manifest in 2025. The question that haunts researchers is not whether Thomas Weatherly's image exists. The evidence is irrefutable. The question is how many others are waiting to be discovered. How many forgotten victims arrest their images onto glass plates and film negatives in moments of desperate need to be remembered. How many photographs in archives, attics, antique shops, and museum storage contain impossible figures that no one has yet noticed. The systematic review of Victorian-era collections has only examined an estimated 12% of surviving photographs from that period. Hundreds of thousands of images remain unexamined, uninventoried, waiting in darkness. And if the phenomenon extended beyond the Victorian era, if similar conditions could occur with later photographic technologies or even digital images, how would we know? What would we be looking for? Thomas Weatherly sits in his classroom forever, a child who died in darkness, finding his way into light, demanding through his impossible presence that we acknowledge what was done to him and to countless others like him. Science cannot explain how he's there. History cannot deny that he is. And somewhere in the world, in archives we haven't searched, and photographs we haven't examined, other forgotten victims are waiting for someone to finally see them.